Hi, I'm Michael Warren. Now I can hear some of you saying, oh yeah, he's Bobby Hill from the TV series Hill Street Blues. Someone else might say, no, he played basketball for the great John Wooden at UCLA. Then another voice, faintly an old-timer like myself, might just say, you're both wrong. He shot hoops at South Bend Central. I personally saw him play. Well, all of you are correct. And though the roads we've all traveled have taken us on different journeys, we do have a very special thing in common. We're all from the St. Joseph River Valley. I was born and raised in South Bend. My dad worked for the South Bend Tribune. My mother was employed at Notre Dame and later at Wheelabrator. My brother and sister attended elementary, junior high school, and high school in South Bend. My entire family is part of a rich cultural heritage that people should know about and that I'm honored to tell. Race has been a dominant theme in American history for at least 400 years. It was an issue long before the signing of our Constitution, or even the Declaration of Independence. Much of our local history is likewise rooted in the tension that built up around such issues as slavery and civil rights. Today, African Americans contribute much to the richness and quality of life in the St. Joseph Valley region of Indiana and Michigan. Teachers, business people, mentors, protectors, athletes, civil servants, professionals, laborers, people raising families, entertainers. In these roles and in many others, Black residents of this region strive to make a difference in society overall, as well as within the different cultures of the African American community. Many continue to face struggles and hardships. Troubles common to all people, but particularly those sharing the legacy of the African American experience here and across the country. Yes, that legacy is a story of struggle against prejudice, against restrictive laws, against social codes. But it also tells of interracial cooperation, of noteworthy achievements and contributions, of strength and hope in the face of many challenges. Our area's African American heritage stretches back to the pioneering days and permanent settlements in this region. Some of the earliest Black Americans here were servants or laborers for white settlers. Others carved out lives for themselves as farmers or as the owners of small businesses. They were striving to take part in the life of their communities as fully as possible. Let us remember and retell their story. Congress established the Indiana Territory in 1800 and officially separated the Michigan Territory out of this large expanse in 1805. Indiana became a state in 1816, Michigan in 1837. European and Black settlement began in the St. Joseph Valley region in the 1820s. Our story focuses on two counties, Cass County in Michigan and St. Joseph County in Indiana. Blacks who settled in this region before the Civil War were from three distinct groups. Some were runaway slaves, others had legally won their freedom, and a small number had always been free. They received or purchased land, built homes, and developed the means to support themselves, mostly by farming. The African American pioneers of Cass County drew great strength from their religious faith. We see in their decision to quickly establish a church, Chain Lake Baptist. Founded in the late 1830s, this congregation remains active as the region's oldest African American church. Members of the Society of Friends, or Quakers as they were called, also found their way to this region. Quakers believed in the equality of all men as God's children, but even among the Quakers there were deep divisions over the issue of slavery. As a result, some chose to work more actively against slavery than others. Quaker families from the East began to migrate across the northern tier of states. Some settled in this part of Indiana and Michigan. One Quaker family, the Bonines, set aside a good portion of their farmland near Vandalia, Michigan, for use by fugitive slaves. In 1816, in Mount Pleasant, Ohio, Charles Osborne, a national leader in the abolition movement, published The Philanthropist, the first newspaper to advocate the immediate and unconditional emancipation of slaves. Osborne moved to the Richmond, Indiana area where intense conflict within the church forced him to relocate. He came to the St. Joseph Valley where he provided leadership in the fight against slavery. People who worked against slavery were known as the abolitionists. They wanted to abolish the practice of slavery, to make it illegal throughout the country. The most famous and possibly the most dangerous abolition activity was the Underground Railroad. This was a highly secret, loosely organized, yet very effective system for moving slaves to safety in the North. The name Underground Railroad became popular not long after railroads started crisscrossing our country. However, there were no rails, tracks, or locomotives linked to this system, and there is no clear understanding of why this name was used. Former slaves, free blacks, and white abolitionists guided fugitive slaves from one hiding place to another, traveling on foot or hiding in the backs of wagons, usually in the dark of night and always in secret. The hiding places were called stations, and those who moved the fugitives between stations were referred to as conductors. Free blacks were among the few conductors with enough courage to travel south to help slaves escape. Discovery could mean a return to slavery or even death for the fugitives, and prison for the conductors. Underground railroad routes ran through many of the northern states. Most fugitive slaves hoped to reach Canada, where slavery was outlawed by the British Empire in the 1830s. Since Indiana bordered the slave state of Kentucky and Michigan bordered Canada, it is not surprising that many paths of escape crisscrossed our two states. Because of Indiana's strict laws, this state was a dangerous place for fugitives. In Michigan, the laws were more favorable for the settlement of fugitives. However, even there, the runaways were not entirely safe. Citizens in both states were not unanimous in their opposition to slavery. Some opposed slavery in principle, but did not want blacks to settle in their community. Others opposed slavery because they did not want to see the country torn apart over this issue. A few helped track down fugitive slaves and return them to the South, often for monetary gains. And there were the brave souls who exposed themselves to great dangers to help the fugitive escape. While most runaways moved quickly to Canada, some chose to stay in the northern states. They became part of the 100 or so blacks who settled in the Cass County townships of Calvin and Penn by the late 1840s. The first African American mentioned in the history of Cass County is a man identified only as Lawson, a fugitive slave who arrived with Quaker preacher Henry H. Way in 1836. To support his new free life, Lawson became a farmer. In Indiana, sketchy reports and memories hint at blacks living in the settlements, townships, and villages during the 1820s and 30s. Pioneering fur traders mapped out the village of South Bend in 1831. The 1839 marriage of Peter Coleman and Maria White is the earliest known mention of black people by name in local records. An advertisement from 1840 in the South Bend Free Press reveals Coleman's trade.
Peter Coleman offers his services to the public in the capacity of a horse doctor. From his experience in his profession, he is enabled to treat effectually most of the diseases which horseflesh is heir to.
The first known purchase of land in South Bend by an African American occurred in 1849 when Garrett Smith purchased a lot near the corner of Main Street and LaSalle Street. While African Americans were establishing themselves in South Bend in the mid-1800s, a rural black community was forming in nearby Lakeville. In the mid-1830s, Samuel Huggard, a free black man from Montgomery County, Ohio, applied for the purchase of 80 acres of land about 10 miles south of South Bend. near what is now Potato Creek State Park. By the late 1840s, he and his brother's family had established a small community on the property. Other families soon joined them. The group earned a good reputation and enjoyed a solid relationship with their neighbors, many of whom were from Quaker backgrounds. While 2 underground railroad stations were known to exist within a mile of the Huggard settlement, there is no evidence that members of the family were actually involved. However, chances are they were, for as historian of abolition, J.C. Furness wrote in Goodbye to Uncle Tom,
practically every clump of Negro settlers in the Free States was an underground depot, for the runaway slave considered a blackskin an even more reliable promise of help than a Quaker broadbrim.
We do know that some of South Bend's free African Americans routinely risked their lives and properties by helping the fugitives. They sheltered runaways and raised money to support the Underground Railroad. Among these brave men were local barbers James Washington, J.B. Lott, and Matthew Sawyer, all well-respected men in the local community. Barbershops were places for community discussions, which provided the opportunity to make contacts and pass on information. More blacks settled in the Michigan portion of the St. Joseph Valley than in the Indiana portion. Why this difference? Indiana had some of the toughest restrictions on blacks compared to other states in the region. Indiana also strictly enforced harsh laws against hiding or assisting escaped slaves, while Michigan laws were less severe. But even Michigan's fugitives faced real danger. Slave owners did not tolerate the loss of even one slave. Raids by Southerners trying to get their runaway slaves back were a serious threat. 2 raids in the St. Joseph Valley had both regional and national impact. One, known as the Kentucky Raid, took place in 1847. It involved angry Cass County residents who confronted a group of slave owners abducting several fugitive slaves. The case went to court in Cassopolis with a decision against the Southerners. The ex-slaves quickly traveled to freedom in Canada. The Kentucky owners later sued several men who had helped the slaves. The abolitionists won the lawsuit, but were faced with high court costs. Another raid began in Cassopolis, Michigan, and ended in South Bend. In 1849, Kentucky slave owner John Norris came north with a group of men to capture his runaway slaves. They abducted a woman named Mrs. Powell and her 3 children who had escaped Norris's farm 2 years earlier. As the Kentuckians headed home, anti-slavery forces stopped them just south of South Bend. Norris took the case to court, supporting his claim of ownership of the fugitives. The abolitionists fought for the fugitives' right to freedom. There were a number of emotional moments, such as the one described by E.B. Crocker, a lawyer defending the slaves.
The judge ordered the captives be discharged. Norris had gathered his men around the captives, and the moment the decision was announced, they seized the captives with one hand, brandishing their weapons with the other, threatening to shoot the first man that interfered. Crocker also reported on a very large group of blacks from the Cassopolis area who came to support the fugitives. Numbers of those colored persons estimated at from 75 to 200 persons arrived, many of them in a highly exasperated state, though they conducted themselves with a great coolness. The court ordered the captives be discharged. The colored friends and neighbors of the captives immediately came forward and conducted them out of the courthouse. On the bridge adjacent to town, they halted and made 3 cheers for liberty. They rode off singing songs of freedom.
Norris later sued the abolitionists who opposed him. The court awarded Norris a substantial settlement, causing great financial hardship for some of the men who defended the fugitives. Court victories such as these 2 cases ironically fueled the hopes of African Americans as they aspired and dreamed of a day when they might safely enjoy freedom. But any setbacks and barriers would continue testing the limits of their strength. Events such as the Kentucky Raid affected the entire country. Pro-slavery congressmen used them as part of their ammunition for passing the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. This law gave strong powers to slave owners seeking to recover their property, requiring little proof before a black person was declared a runaway and sent south. The Fugitive Slave Law inflamed the tensions between the North and South, tensions that eventually led to the Civil War. Though many people in Indiana and Michigan opposed slavery, they would not break laws that allowed slave owners to take back their runaways. And some residents simply did not want blacks in the states, whether fugitive or free. These issues and more made it extremely dangerous to be labeled an abolitionist or in any way be connected to the Underground Railroad. When the Indiana State Constitution was rewritten in 1851, Article 13 made it illegal for blacks to come into or settle in the state. In 1852, Indiana ordered counties to count the number of Negro residents and record them as part of the state's Negro Registry. Most counties did not comply, and state authorities did not enforce the requirement. Even so, such regulations without a doubt discouraged blacks from settling in Indiana. It was also in 1852 that Harriet Beecher Stowe published her abolitionist novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. The book's strong and dramatic anti-slavery message dramatized and strengthened the abolitionist cause. One South Bend native, Charles Bartlett, had clear childhood memories of the effect of Stowe's book in this area.
Numerous copies of this appealing volume suddenly appeared. They were passed from hand to hand. The book was read with profound interest. Teachers in the day schools could not keep silent. They read aloud from Mrs. Stowe's astonishing book. The pulpit took up the theme and thundered effectively in behalf of the black man. It is significant that for nearly 2 years, Uncle Tom's Cabin would cut short the talk on any other topic.
Bartlett's mother organized a women's literary group to discuss the novel, but the group soon went beyond the boundaries of literature. The women collected funds for the abolitionist movement, an activity that may today seem harmless, but was fraught with danger in those times and was generally carried on in secrecy. In 1858, Northern Indiana witnessed the power and moral strength of one of America's most famous black women, Sojourner Truth. When she passed through this area on a tour, Truth proclaimed the message that slavery was a great evil which needed to be purged from the country. At the same time, many white Americans were concerned about business, politics, and the clash between Northern and Southern lifestyles. People strongly disagreed over the power of the federal government to decide the slavery question. These rising tensions and conflicts were some of the major issues that led to the Civil War. Southerners were bitterly angry and afraid. They also feared that the North would attempt to control the federal government and destroy their way of life. Northerners, in turn, feared that the Southern politicians would take over the government in an effort to protect slavery. These issues led to the formation of the Republican Party in the mid-1850s. South Bend resident Schuyler Colfax was deeply involved in the founding of the party. He strongly opposed the spread of slavery into new states and territories. Colfax became a candidate for the Republican Party, serving first as a congressman, then as a Speaker of the House of Representatives, and finally as Vice President of the United States. In 1860, the Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln for president. Many Southerners were sure that a Republican victory would set the federal government on a course to end slavery. Within months of Lincoln's election, 11 Southern states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. The Confederate attack on Fort Sumter at Charleston, South Carolina in April of 1861 sparked the Civil War that many had prayed would never come. At first, blacks were not allowed to serve in the Union Army. But in 1863, Lincoln changed the rules and black men rushed to join the fight. He stated,
"The colored population is the great available and yet unavailed of force for restoring the Union."
While many of the African American volunteers were uneducated fugitive slaves, others were educated freemen. All shared a common hope that a Union victory would bring freedom to all blacks. There were some blacks, however, who were opposed to fighting for a country that had denied them citizenship. and even in northern states, they were not considered totally free and equal. African Americans did not have the right to vote, could not serve on juries or testify against white people. As for most of the 19th century, customs and laws discouraged or prevented black children from getting an education. But the large number of African American men who joined the military showed an overall desire to be actively involved in the fight for freedom. Nearly 180,000 black men nationwide joined the Union forces. The United States colored troops helped meet the Union's great need for new recruits, and the African Americans had the opportunity to prove their valor. At least 1,500 blacks from Indiana and 1,400 from Michigan became Union soldiers. Counted in that number were 3 brothers from the Powell family in South Bend and Mishawaka: Elijah, Colonel, and Squire. Though the government gave African Americans the opportunity to join the Union forces, black soldiers were not treated as equals. For instance, the Union Army did not keep its promise to give the same pay to black and white soldiers. Emory Allen, an Indiana resident who served in the 55th Massachusetts Regiment, was among black soldiers who sent Lincoln protest letters. The soldiers eventually received equal pay. Allen later died in battle, one of roughly 36,000 African Americans who sacrificed their lives for the dream of freedom. About 150 black men from Cass and Berrien counties joined a unit known as the 1st Michigan Colored Infantry, later referred to as the 102nd U.S. Colored Infantry. Black Indiana recruits served in the U.S. Colored Troops 28th Regiment. General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia surrendered in April 1865, and the Civil War ended shortly thereafter. Soon after the war's end, a few outward signs of improving conditions for blacks began to appear. In December 1865, the country ratified the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, abolishing slavery. Within 5 years, the 14th Amendment recognized blacks as American citizens. The 15th gave voting rights to black men. These new laws were historic and eventually life-changing for the entire country. They did not, however, change people's prejudices or immediately improve race relations and the treatment of African Americans. In Indiana, black children were not allowed to attend public schools until 1869. In that year, the Indiana legislature passed the 15th Amendment to the state constitution, establishing separate black schools. In 1873, the state superintendent of education reported that integrated schools were operating in areas where the number of black children was too small to support a blacks-only school. Northern Indiana was one of those areas. How did the new legal rights affect life in the St. Joseph Valley? In some ways, the changes were in line with the life that African Americans in this region already knew. Black families and farmers, particularly in Michigan, were already established. Race relations had generally been positive for a generation. Therefore, it is not surprising that between 1860 and 1880, the black population in Cass County grew from 1,375 to 1,800. In that same 20 years, St. Joseph County's black population increased from 88 to almost 280. A sign of the new rights and privileges for African Americans appeared in the 1871 issue of the St. Joseph Valley Register. The May 25th newspaper carried this notice about one of the founders of the rural black settlement in Union Township.
Andrew Huggard is serving as a juryman in Common Pleas Court now in session, the first colored man who has ever officiated in that capacity in this county.
Progress, however, was slow. In 1871, the Indiana General Assembly sponsored a bill to deny voting rights to black men. This bill declared that the United States Constitution's new 15th Amendment was not a valid law. While the bill did not pass, Neither did a Republican bill that would have given black men more influence in Indiana politics. A History of Cass County, published in 1882, mentions black men who were serving as justice of the peace and the township clerk. The article also reported that a majority of the township voters were black and that black teachers were working in integrated schools within the mostly black settlements. The writer of this history commends several black farmers and business people for their hard work and good standing in the community. Included was Lucinda Stewart, a Civil War widow who continued running the 150-acre family farm after her husband's death. Booker T. Washington visited Cass County in 1903 to learn about the black settlement there. He wrote the following explanation of how he had learned of this area.
My attention was first attracted to this settlement some years ago when I was in South Bend, Indiana. I noticed that the colored people of South Bend seemed to be unusually prosperous and a solid lot of people. From this discussion of the condition of the colored people in South Bend, Mr. Studebaker called my attention to the large community of colored people in Calvin Township, Michigan.
By the time of Washington's turn-of-the-century visit, Cass County's African-American population was on a steady decline from its peak of just over 1,800 people some 20 years earlier. This change reflected a common trend in America at the time: the migration from rural areas to towns and cities such as South Bend. People were in search of jobs in the country's growing industries. At the same time, America's southern black population was beginning to move north in large numbers, also in search of work. South Bend, home to major industries such as Studebaker, Oliver, and Singer, was one of the many northern cities to benefit from this migration. The city's overall population skyrocketed from 7,200 to nearly 54,000 in the years from 1870 to 1910. The number of African American residents increased at a slightly faster rate than the total population, from 73 to 604. As the 19th century reached its end, African Americans in the South Bend area showed a strong interest in maintaining their traditions and ensuring a rich and lasting culture for their people. In 1873, a group of black residents in South Bend organized their first church, Olivet AME. Farrell and Rebecca Powell were among the founding trustees. This congregation still remains active today in worship, community service, and the perpetuation of traditions and values. In 1900, black women organized the South Bend chapter of the St. Pierre Ruffin Club. The club's mission to promote cultural and educational activities continues today. Another popular local women's organization was the Our Day Together Club, and local chapters of the Knights of Pythians, the Masons, and the Order of Eastern Star were organized. Black men in the St. Joseph Valley region made a living as farmers, laborers, barbers, cooks, porters, and businessmen, while many black women worked as domestic help for white families. Records suggest that some African American women ran their own businesses. Among them was Katherine Jackson, who continued to run her husband's barbershop after he died in the mid-1870s, and Lottie Huggard, a dressmaker in South Bend. African American life in the St. Joseph Valley at the turn of the century was comparatively good, but serious challenges remained. World War I, the rise of industries, migration of blacks from south to north, massive immigration of people from European countries, and the growth of racial hate groups were challenges to be faced in the coming years. First-hand stories draw a fairly positive picture of relations between white and blacks of the St. Joseph Valley in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Historical reports give the same impression. Some say the influence of Quakers and other abolitionists helped to support this positive situation. Others think the races got along well partly because the majority of the population did not yet see African Americans as an economic threat or a social problem. But surely reasons that are more positive also explain the situation. The character and values of the African Americans who came to the St. Joseph Valley, the way they treated one another and members of other races, the determination to prove themselves and to make a good life, the strength they showed in holding on to their hopes and in working to bring these hopes to life. Perhaps Booker T. Washington said it best.
In the story of this development, there's nothing startling or remarkable. It is simply the story of growth of a people when given the American chance to grow naturally and gradually.
Race is still an issue in today's society, despite 400 years of shared history. A bloody civil war resolved the issue of slavery, but lingering tensions remain. We saw them rise again during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. We can still see them in the ongoing debates over affirmative action and high-profile court cases. These issues defy easy solutions. But all too often, we fail to apply what we have learned from history, increasing the danger that the tragic events of the past will repeat themselves. This story is not just a simple history lessons filled with names, dates, and facts. It is a living source of strength, hope, and challenge for everyone who wants a good life, a truly free life, for everyone in the St. Joseph Valley.